cramping my style with the losing a place to sit my Bible, but glad that you are here today, glad that you are joining us. We're going to be in John chapter 10 to start with, if you want to turn over there. Getting a little bit of a late start because we had a large group of visitors first service, so blessed to have them here and got to have some neat conversations with them as they are on their way back to Chicago. I'm thankful I am here today and not making that drive. Also, I am going to try to save my voice a bit during class because I am subbing in on the worship team this morning, kind of a last minute thing, and my voice is feeling that. I didn't think it would, but it is. So this may be just a little bit shorter than what we normally do. John chapter 10 is where we're going to be. We're in Ezekiel chapter 34 in our sermon today. And I mentioned in first service that that's one of my favorite texts, but it's also one of the texts that I hate preaching from. And I'll tell you why. It's a text that does really good at convicting everybody all the way around all the time. Like you can't walk away from that text and go, well, he's not talking about me. There's enough sin blame there to go around. And it deals specifically with the shepherds of Israel not doing their job and the sheep of Israel, the flock, not doing their job. And so God is going to set things right by sending a shepherd. Again, that's what the sermon is about. But I was asked to preach at a church one time. It's been a few years ago. And I thought, okay, I know what I'm going to do. There were some local, it was not a church service like a typical worship service. We were getting together, we were worshiping, but it was like a fellowship of church leaders in the area kind of thing. And I got asked to preach at that, and I thought, well, okay, I'll do something. And I had this plan all figured out. I was like, I know what I'm going to do. And then I went to sleep that night, and I had this weird dream of Ezekiel 34. And I went, and that was weird. Well, I need to get ready, plan what I'm saying today. And I kept looking at it, and it was just Ezekiel 34, Ezekiel 34. So I got in the shower, and it takes a while for me to wash my hair. and I was spending extra time in the shower, and my wife is going, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, I don't know why, but I feel like I should preach from Exodus 34. She's like, well, do whatever you think is best. And I'm like, I don't think it's good. I don't want to I don't want to do that. And so I went to that church with everything planned out to do the other sermon. And when I got up there, it was just that overwhelming, I need to preach Ezekiel 34. So I did, and I challenged the church leaders to be the leaders that God has called them to be. I church members who are there, hey, we have a mission to do, and if our lives and if our actions don't match what we say about ourselves, well, God's going to take us out. He's going to find people who will, and He's going to fill those spots with people who will. So our challenge is, and I didn't do it negatively. Like I wasn't, berating people or throwing tables or anything like that. I mean, I was just like, hey, we've got a job to do. We need to do it. As soon as that service was over, I had a lot of people come by and go, thank you. Like just real solemnly. And I'm like, you're welcome. Then I had somebody else come up. If I mentioned the person's name, you guys would probably recognize who it was. Came up to me and goes, man, do I have a story to tell you. I was like, okay. He said, there was a long time ago, I was asked to preach at this church, and I had my own plans about the thing, but God just kept laying on my heart, I needed to preach Ezekiel 34, and I didn't really want to do it. And I'm sitting here going, okay. And he said, I went ahead and preached the sermon, and about a week later, that church closed. They felt so convicted they weren't doing the job, they thought they'd be better off if they were just closed. And he just patted me on the back and goes, good job, and walked off. I'm like, I Kid you not, about a week later, that church we were at announced that they were going to close. So it's a powerful text. It's one that I like because it reminds us all that we have a responsibility to do. I wasn't planning on closing anything, right? And neither was the other person who told me that story. But I was like, so maybe we need to hear this text a little bit more often than not. What is amazing about Jesus is that every time he opens his mouth, he sounds an awful lot like his Father. And by that, yeah, it's a little humorous, right? But I'm serious. Almost everything he says has its root in the Old Testament. And what he's doing is either quoting it, or he's alluding to it, or he's giving commentary about it, shine light on it. There's a text that I think is usually way misunderstood what Jesus is saying. In Matthew chapter 19, he's asked a question about divorce, but he's asked a very, very, very specific question about divorce. And if you understand your Old Testament, he's asking a very, very specific question about a text in Deuteronomy. That's what Jesus is answering. And so he's constantly going back to your Old Testament. He's constantly dealing with things in your Old Testament. We just don't know it because, let's be honest, we're very ignorant of our Old Testament. Okay? So when Jesus says, I came to seek and save the lost, he's quoting the Old Testament. He's quoting Ezekiel 34. In John chapter 10, we get a very blatant example of Jesus alluding to a text and saying about what it means about him. So if you were here first service, this may make a lot more sense to you. If you were not here first service, stick around for second service. You'll hear the sermon. You'll go, oh, that's what's going on here. So chapter 10 of John says this, very truly I tell you Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Now, with texts like this, there's often a lot of people who argue about exactly what is Jesus alluding to. If you notice that there is this area where the sheep are, the pen, and he's saying the people who go in the gate, that's the shepherd. The people who try to sneak in it from other way, they're there for not good motives. Okay? So, question is, who's he talking about? Well, obviously he's getting ready to make a statement. It's not a spoiler alert that he's the good shepherd, right? So what is it with these other people who are coming about getting in that sheep pen by some other means and it's corrupt? What you need to know is that after the Greeks came down and kind of ransacked Jerusalem, Jerusalem got back up and running under the Maccabees, and there was a time where Israel was self-governed, but it was not governed in the way that the Lord had told them to be governed. For instance, the way that they were doing the priesthood was not with the Levitical stuff that it was supposed to be. The king in charge was not from the line of David. There was a government there, but it was not what the Lord had said in your Old Testament. That's gone, that's done away with at that point. And so there's a lot of people who are questioning, well, who's really the leader? Who do we really follow? Is there some other king? Should we take these guys out of office, put somebody else in king? At the same time, you've got all these other governing authorities that say, well, no, that's our land. So you're actually subjects of Greece. You're actually subjects of Rome. You're actually, all these other, Egypt even at one point. On top of this, when the Romans do come down and say, no, you're Roman now, the priesthood gets bought. Wealthy people who want to be priests, who aren't qualified to be priests, who shouldn't be priests, who would never get to be priests but have money, get themselves into the sheep pen so they can take care of the sheep by bribery, by paying for it. You talk about King Herod, same thing. That's a whole other rabbit trail that we're not going to run down. But the people who are the shepherds of Israel, if you're doing things the way that the Lord had said in the Old Testament, they would never be the shepherd places. They've bought it, they've bribed their way, they've blackmailed people into that position. These are the people that are leading God's people in the ways of the Lord, right? Even murdering to some extent to get there. And so when Jesus comes in, he starts talking about people who are mingling around with the sheep, pretending to be the shepherds, aren't really the shepherds because they'd come in by legitimate means. He's condemning the whole structure. All those in power, he's calling them all out. P.S. We wonder why they wanted to kill him? Yeah, he's telling them you're a bunch of corrupt people. Look at verse 6. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. What? Verse 7. Therefore Jesus said it again so that they would understand. Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. Now, think about that for a minute. I am the gate of the sheep. If the sheep are the people, and we've seen shepherd used over and over again for the leaders of Israel, what is Jesus saying about himself being the gate? What does that mean? Through him is the only way to be able to get into the pen. Now, who would be in that pen? Sheep. So how do sheep, lost sheep, wandering sheep, sheep of another pen, how do they get into the pen that Jesus is talking about? Say it again. They're led in, but they have to go through that gate, right? They can't go through another way. At least if you have better fences than I do, the sheep can't go through any other way other than the gate. We're going to get there. We're going to get there, okay? So he's just set up. Sheep enter this pen. The people who are claiming to be shepherds in the pen aren't actually shepherds. They didn't come in through a legitimate means. By the way, I'm the gate. So if anybody's going to get into this pen, they have to do it through me. Shepherd or sheep. Okay? I am the gate, verse 8. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. Okay, so again, if you've got your brain trained on Ezekiel 34 now, and you're thinking about all the things that those shepherds did, and all the things even that the sheep did, you're starting to track with this and go, oh, okay. Verse 9, I am the gate, and whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out. They'll find good pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So again, any other means, any other leadership, any other way into this group, if it doesn't involve Jesus, you're a liar, you're a thief, you're a murderer. How does that sound? That makes it very clear. Again, I had a conversation with somebody this week that basically boiled down all faith and all religions to, well, it's all just a matter of preference anyway. We're all going to the same place, right? Is that what Jesus means by saying, I'm the gate and I'm the only way in? He says it more explicitly other places, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. Those are passages that people love to conveniently leave out when they think there's other ways to go about this. Jesus doesn't leave any wiggle room for this. There are no other ways around this. Either you go through him, by him, or you don't go. Again, it's not a comfortable situation to sit with, but Ezekiel 34 is not a comfortable text either. And so Jesus inserts himself into Ezekiel 34 directly by saying this. Verse 11, I am the good shepherd. Now again, that can mean a lot of things to us, but if you realize that Yahweh, the God of Israel, said, I am the good shepherd, who's Jesus claiming to be? God in human form. That is a huge claim. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd, does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. Yes, remember Ezekiel 34 about all the sheep scattered because they don't have a shepherd? This kind of stuff. The people who are there, they're just pretending. They're not actually there. Verse 13, the man runs away because he is a hired hand. He cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Now I have other sheep too that are not of the sheep pen, and I must bring them also, and they too will listen to my voice. And there shall be one flock and one shepherd. Pause on that for just a moment. If you are Israel and you have accepted the label of sheep that God has placed on you, and I told Larry Boo this a little bit earlier, I've had sheep now twice in my life. I am convinced that God calling us sheep is not a compliment. I will just leave it at that. We have two at the moment. One of them is super sweet. When he sees you coming, his little tail just waggles, and he's excited, and he comes up to you, and then he'll just kind of rub against you like, you haven't petted me. You haven't scratched my ears yet, and you just pet him. You say, ah. The other one looks at you, and you're like, here, come right on in. And she just looks at you. I got your food. And she just looks at you. You're like, well, here, I'll give you some food. Takes off. She'll go find food somewhere else. Okay. God calls us sheep. Let's be honest. Aren't we like that sometimes? He's like, here's the way. And you're like, nope, I'll figure it out. But if you notice, Jesus' sheep learn to trust his voice. They learn to listen to him. He doesn't have to poke and prod them and whack them with a stick. He calls them and they follow. Why? Because he's willing to lay down his life for them. He's giving them something that they've never had. He's doing something for them that it's never been done for them. And he says that my sheep are not only of this pen. Again, if you're Israel and you've been the flock, you are God's flock, what other pens are there? What other sheep are there? In your mind, there aren't. There's these horrible Gentiles out there. Well, they're not God's flock. And what does Jesus say? I'm the good shepherd. I'm the one who seeks and saves the lost. And I've got other sheep that'll be in this pen. And they're all going to be one flock. It's not going to be two. It's not going to be scattered. It's not going to be, well, we've got some stray sheep out there, but, hey, maybe one of these. No. I'm going to bring them all together as one. And there will be one flock, one shepherd. Verse 17. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. And I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it back up again. This command I received from my Father. The Jews heard these words. The Jews who had heard these words were divided. Many of them said, he's demon-possessed. He's raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon really open the eyes of a blind? And so you see, as you hear this message of Jesus come, there's some people who listen to it and they're like, it's got to be the word of the Lord. This can't be anything other. But you've got some who hear it and go, nope, don't like it. Don't want to listen to it. Don't want to change. Don't want to abide by that. So in this little portion of John, just, 17? Well, Jesus doesn't even speak for 17, 18 verses, because there's some commentary in there as well. But in just this little section of one little chapter, Jesus has dropped himself into the entire Ezekiel 34 story by claiming that he is the way to become a sheep, to get into the sheep pen. Anybody else who claims to be a shepherd is a liar, a thief, or a murderer. They're out there for no good. And he is the good shepherd. And he's going to go out and find other sheep that are not ever in the flock. And he's going to bring them in, and he's going to be their one shepherd. And there's only going to be one flock. Now, how radical do you think that was in Jesus' world? So radical they wanted to stone him. If you have been trained your whole life that it's an us versus them mentality, you can't turn the Titanic on a dime. P.S. There's a whole museum dedicated to that just right down there. You can't. And so there's this whole movement of people that just, this is the way we're going, this is what we think, this is how it is. And they can't even get their mind wrapped around that. Now, I want you to turn over to another chapter 10, and this is going to be Acts chapter 10. I almost said Luke 2, 2nd Luke chapter 10. Acts chapter 10. Now we have Luke, the doctor, talking to us, telling us this story about Peter. Now, just to remind ourselves, jog our minds, who is Peter? Also known as Cephas. Not, well, yeah. Denied Jesus, yeah. Yeah. He did, yeah. Yeah, he stayed with Jesus to this point. That's an interesting text. And Luke is the one that records it. Jesus makes certain that his disciples have swords with them. He makes certain. If you don't have a sword, sell your jacket and get one. And they're like, we got 2 of them. And Jesus goes, okay, that'll work. Jesus wants them armed. He wants them protected. But when does he call out Peter? Peter doesn't defend himself. Peter goes on the attack. If that were in criminal court today, he would be guilty. Because he didn't act in self-defense. He attacked, and at that point, Jesus got upset at him, undoes it, heals the ear. But there was a point to it. Jesus wanted to protect his disciples. He wanted them to defend themselves. And Peter was all for it when he thought he was in control of the situation. I'm going to lead this thing. When Jesus goes, nope. Then he starts denying Jesus. He's ready for the fight, but he's not ready for the stress. And when he has to sit back and let things unfold, that's when he starts going, no, I don't know the guy. I don't know the guy. He's one of the closest friends of Jesus. He's in that inner 3 of Peter, James, and John that get to see Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. They get to see things that the rest of the 12 never get to see. They get to hear things that the rest never get to hear. He's one of the closest walkers with Jesus. He walks on the water for a moment before he takes his eyes off of Jesus and sinks. He sees Jesus go to the Gentile side of the island and cast demons out of a demon-possessed man and do all this with Gentiles. And yet, it takes the Holy Spirit redoing Pentecost for Peter to get over himself. Because this idea that it's us versus them, that they're not our pen, that we can't associate with them, runs so deeply, and we see it here in chapter 10. Chapter 10, verse 1 of Acts. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. This was a Delta Force operator in the Roman army. This is one of the, he is a battle-hardened leader of the battle-hardened guys, okay? And he and all his family were devout and God-fearing. And he gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. What Zacchaeus is, if you were here first service, you get this. If Zacchaeus was the boogeyman on one front, this guy's the boogeyman on the other front. Like, but yet he's God-fearing and religious and he's doing good things. A lot of the things that Israel's not doing. One day at about 3 p.m, Cornelius had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius?" Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." So again, Cornelius gets another devout soldier, he's had an influence on this soldier. The soldier worships the Lord as well. They send him, they go find Peter. In the meantime, Peter gets a dream. 3 times. And the idea here is that the Lord is telling Peter to eat these unclean animals, and Peter is arguing with the Lord going, "I'm not going to do that." And the Lord says, "I've made it clean. It's okay." So he learned his lesson, right? No. Vision again. Same argument. Vision again. Same argument. Finally, these Gentiles show up and say, "Hey, you're supposed to come with us." Keep in mind, one of them is a soldier. Peter's like, "Okay, maybe this is what God wanted me to do, right? I'll follow along." There's some irony for you. What do tanners do? They tan what? Animal hides, right? Dead animal hides. And what does contacting dead animal hides do to you ceremonially? Makes you unclean. Doesn't make you sinful. Doesn't make you sinful. Makes you ritually unclean. That may take more unpacking than we have time to do. Let's just put it this way. I have multiple toothbrushes at my house. One I use for cleaning my mouth. One I use for cleaning grout. Cleaning things around the house, right? The two are not the same. They may look the same, but they are not the same. One is reserved for me. One is reserved for everything else, right? So the toothbrush that is in my bathroom that is next to my sink, that one is holy. It's clean. It is usable for that purpose. One of the things I love about the Old Testament is it makes us think about ourselves. When you went to worship, again, I'm not knocking anybody here. I'll put myself in this example, right? I came to the church building this morning at 5-something in the morning, listening to a podcast to wake up. Drinking my coffee, doing my thing, right? I'm getting stuff going in my ears to kind of get me awake and to get me, okay, drove here, didn't run over anything, didn't run anybody off the road, that kind of thing. Got here and I wake up and I do my things and I'm just instantly doing all the stuff, right? And so trying to get my sermon ready, trying to make sure all the slides are working, trying to do that. Same time I hear that somebody is sick on worship team and I'm like, well, I'll help. Okay, so now I get thrown into this and I'm doing this and I'm doing, okay, all right? So I came into worship this morning doing all that kind of stuff. In the Old Testament, you would start the day before, preparing yourself for worship. And you'd be thinking about, why am I going and what am I doing? What is my standing before the Lord? What kind of sacrifice do I need to bring today to communicate with God what is going on in my life? What animal that I have raised from a baby is going to lose its life today because of what I have done? It changes things. You're constantly thinking about yourself. You're constantly thinking about your actions. If I'm getting ready to go to a feast, I'm going to change my lifestyle to make sure that I am prepared to enter God's presence in worship. There are things I will not do this week because I want to go to church on Sunday. It changed everything. We don't tend to do that anymore. For better or for worse, again, it's not an argument, it's different. And so here you have Peter living in the house of a tanner that would have made him ceremonially unclean. And he's now going to go to a Gentile house and be afraid to go in it because it is unclean. Think about the hypocrisy there. I'm okay with this unclean, I'm not okay with that unclean. Now again, unclean does not mean sinful. Everybody hear me on that? Okay? We're going to pivot to sinful. How often are we much more comfortable with our sin than somebody else's sin? There's a story, I believe it's true, I heard it from the preacher. This preacher, pretty well-known guy, and he was known for giving very challenging sermons about us living our life. Does our life align with what Christ has called us to? Are we carrying out our mission? Somebody stopped him one Sunday morning after church was over and said, "Pastor, I think you need to preach more about sin." The pastor said, "Okay, what sin do you deal with?" And the guy went, "Well, not my sin. I think you ought to preach about sin." The pastor said, "Well, why in the world would you want to hear a sermon about somebody else's sin? Why wouldn't you want to hear about how you deal with your own sin?" But that's not what he wanted. He wanted somebody to point the finger and go, "All those people out there are sinful. All that group of people is horrible. All that group of people..." Yeah. And so Simon Peter is okay with his little uncleanliness, but not somebody else's uncleanliness. Again, there's this hypocrisy there, and thank you for pointing that out. So Peter goes to Joppa. He leaves Joppa. He goes with them to where they are. This is verse 23 and a half of Acts 10. The next day, Peter started out with them, and some of the believers from Joppa went along. The following day, he arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together all of his relatives and close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him but fell at his feet in reverence. Peter made him get up. "Stand up. I'm only a guy. Don't do that." Verse 27, while talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people, and he said to him, "You're well aware that it's against our law for a Jew to associate with or even visit a Gentile. But God's shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without raising an objection. Now, why am I here?" That's basically it. Again, it took walking with Jesus, seeing Jesus' entire ministry and 3 visions and a messenger, and he still gets to the door of the house and goes, "This is kind of icky for me." But let's be honest, what has Jesus called us to? Icky things. One of the best statements I've heard about church, about faith, about walking with the Lord is that it's messy. And it is. We like things black and white. We like things very, very clear. We like to know, this is wrong and that's not, and this is... And again, there's plenty of that in your Bible, but there's an awful lot of gray too. Don't contact people who are unclean, or you will be unclean. Okay? But mightn't I get unclean every now and again because my neighbor is unclean and I can help them get out of the mess they're in? It may cause me to miss out on something I want to do, but if I'm supposed to look out. Think about Cain and Abel. Let's just go back to Genesis, because it all goes back to Genesis, right? The question that is asked, the Lord goes, "Hey, where's your brother?" What's the response? Am I my brother's keeper? And we see that thrown around so many times, right? What's the answer supposed to be? Yes! You're supposed to look out for one another. You're supposed to care for one another. It's not I'm not my brother's keeper. Well, you ought to be. You ought to be looking out for one another. You ought to be taking care of one another. You ought to be willing to get messy, because life is messy. And messy people need help cleaning up sometimes. So this whole us versus them, this whole that pen, but now Jesus is saying, I'm the gate, I'm the shepherd, I get to put whoever I want to in that pen, and they're coming in. And yet even with that, Peter's still like, I don't know. we may have to spend some time in Acts. But because it's like Luke has finally figured this out. I think ministering with Paul certainly helped him figure this out. But all the way through his gospel and all the way through his second gospel, Acts, he keeps hammering this theme of it's not us versus them. You're going to find faith in places you don't expect it. God has sheep in other pastures that you don't think are worth even keeping around, and yet God has them. And so it's this very different mentality than what Jesus' world had in mind, what Luke's world has in mind, and I'll be honest, it's much different than what our world has in mind a lot of times. Again, how long does it take you to turn on the TV and see some sort of us versus them? Sports is easy to knock on, right? You root for the wrong team? We'll razz each other in good. Say it again. Rivalries. Yeah, big rivalry week. I remember when I was growing up, I had an uncle who lived in Washington, D.C. My aunt worked at the White House, and they were big Washington Redskin football commander team fans. I live north of Dallas. Guess who I rooted for? And every time they played, that phone rang. One way or the other, the phone rang, and one of us was calling to razz the other. Again, good humor, but it's a good example. How often do we divide over very little, very small, meaningless things? And it can cause huge issues. Jesus didn't come to divide. He came to unite. And when he comes to unite, it will cause division, because there's some people that go, I just don't want any part of that. There's more unpacking that needs to be done, but we're out of time. Over the next couple of weeks, Lord willing, we'll unpack that some more. So, grab some coffee, grab some refreshments, talk to somebody. I'm going to try to save my voice, and we will gather for worship in about 15 minutes.